Everyone thinks the Cold War press was independent. The documents suggest otherwise. For decades, the official story held that American journalism during the Cold War was a bastion of freedom, watchdogs holding power accountable, reporting truth to the public without interference. The First Amendment was sacred. The press was free. That's what we were taught, and for good reason. It was largely true. But in 1975, when the Church Committee began investigating the CIA's domestic operations, they uncovered something that complicated that narrative considerably, and it changed how we should think about the relationship between intelligence agencies and the newsrooms that shape public opinion. The operation had a code name, Mockingbird, and according to declassified files and congressional testimony, it wasn't a small, isolated effort. The CIA had systematically cultivated relationships with major news outlets, not just local papers, but the heavyweights, the Washington Post, the New York Times, CBS, Associated Press. Hundreds of journalists, some knowingly, many unknowingly, became extensions of the agency's intelligence apparatus. Now here's where the story gets complicated. The declassified record doesn't show a coordinated, centralized conspiracy with an org chart and signed orders. Instead, it reveals something messier and in some ways more insidious: informal networks, friendly relationships, shared worldviews. A CIA operative would contact a journalist, sometimes a friend from college, sometimes a source they'd cultivated over years, and ask for a favor. Not always money changed hands. Sometimes it was just access. Sometimes it was just ideology aligning. By the early 1970s, the CIA had relationships with at least 400 journalists, according to some estimates. 400, that's not a conspiracy in the traditional sense, it's something more like institutional capture. The agency didn't need to control the narrative outright, they just needed to shape it at the margins, kill a story here, plant a favorable angle there, make sure certain embarrassing truths never made it into print. But here's the crucial part, the part that shifts the entire picture. When the Church Committee and later investigative journalists like Carl Bernstein dug into the details, the evidence for a deliberate, centralized Operation Mockingbird became surprisingly thin. There was no smoking gun memo, no budget line labeled press manipulation, no master list of controlled assets with names and objectives. What emerged instead was a pattern, a culture. The CIA had cultivated relationships with journalists, this much was documented. Some relationships were transactional, some were ideological, some were born from simple friendship between intelligence officers and reporters who saw the world in similar ways. But the leap from the CIA knows journalists to the CIA controls the American press requires evidence that historians have struggled to produce. The real story, the one supported by declassified records, is actually more nuanced and frankly more troubling in its implications. It wasn't Operation Mockingbird as a discrete program with a beginning and an end. It was something that grew organically out of the Cold War itself. When you have an existential struggle against communism, when you have intelligence agencies convinced that the very survival of the nation depends on controlling information, relationships form, favors get asked, ethics get negotiated. Take this detail right here. In 1953, the CIA launched Operation Ajax in Iran, overthrowing the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. The American press, the supposedly independent American press, barely reported on CIA involvement. Why? Partly because journalists didn't know the full truth, but partly because those who did know had relationships with the agency. And those relationships created a kind of gravitational pull towards certain narratives and away from others. Or consider the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. The New York Times knew about the planned operation before it happened. They had the story. They could have exposed it. They chose not to, partly out of patriotism, partly out of deference to the CIA, partly because the relationships between their reporters and intelligence officials made it hard to see clearly. These weren't orders from on high. They were the products of shared assumptions and institutional pressure. So what was Operation Mockingbird really? It wasn't a centralized propaganda machine, though it had elements of that. It was the CIA's cultivation of influence within the media ecosystem through personal relationships, ideological alignment, and the simple fact that reporters and intelligence officers often came from the same social class, attended the same universities, belonged to the same clubs. They understood each other. They trusted each other. And that trust could be leveraged. The implications are staggering. If you accept this reading and the evidence supports it, then the Cold War public was never really receiving independent reporting on intelligence operations. They were receiving a curated version of events, filtered through relationships between journalists and the institutions they were supposed to scrutinize. The press wasn't controlled like a puppet, but it was influenced like a friend asking for a favor. What makes this even more relevant today is that the structures enabling this kind of influence haven't disappeared. Intelligence agencies still cultivate relationships with journalists, still leak selectively, still rely on the fact that reporters and spies often inhabit overlapping worlds. The specific names and operations have changed, but the fundamental dynamic, the blurred line between journalism and intelligence, persists. The Church Committee's investigation in 1975 exposed the relationships and prompted reforms. Journalists became more aware of the risks of being too close to intelligence sources. Ethical guidelines were strengthened. But institutional pressures don't disappear just because they're named. They evolve, they persist. And the question of where journalism ends and intelligence begins remains, to this day, genuinely contested. What Operation Mockingbird really teaches us is that power doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always come with explicit orders. Sometimes it moves through relationships, through shared worldviews, through the quiet understanding between people who see themselves as being on the same side. And that's exactly why it's so difficult to detect and so dangerous to ignore. The documents are declassified now, the history is written, but the patterns they reveal, the ways institutions shape information, the ways relationships blur ethical lines, the ways power operates through consensus rather than coercion, those patterns are still very much alive. Understanding Operation Mockingbird isn't about solving a historical mystery, it's about recognizing how influence actually works. The CIA didn't need to control the press, they just needed to be friends with it, and that friendship, that's what the declassified files really show us. Not a conspiracy, but something subtler and more profound. The way institutions protect themselves, the way power operates through networks, and the way truth becomes negotiable when the people asking questions are also the people being asked favors. If you want to understand how Cold War intelligence shaped the information Americans received, and why those patterns still matter today, subscribe. There's a new unsolved case, a new twist on what we thought we knew, every single week. Subscribe, there's a new Cold War intelligence story every week, and some of them will change how you see the news.